Greetings to all of you. A very warm welcome to this virtual session of the Asia and the Pacific Transport Forum. My name is Preety Bhandari. I'm the Chief of the Climate Change and Disaster Risk Management team at the Asian Development Bank, and it is my honor to moderate this session on enabling stronger upstream action for environmental, climate, and disaster resilience in the transport infrastructure. We have a very good lineup of speakers with immense experience to make for a very interesting session on this very subject. And while you all are getting used to this virtual world, I'm sure some of you may have attended the sessions, very interesting sessions that were held on Monday and Tuesday in this virtual transport forum, where we had some very interesting discussions on what the new normal in the transport sector and systems would look like, and the criticality of this moment to rethink and reimagine the future of the transport sector and systems. So we've had a very good series of discussions the last 2 days, and it is my hope that this session will also provide food for thought to many of you who have joined us for this particular session. In this session, we hope to examine resilience from various dimensions, looking beyond the physical aspects of resilience insofar as it relates to managing the damages to the infrastructure, to a larger construct looking at mobility, connectivity, and also issues related to maintaining supplies, the supply chains, and continuity of services. And the eminent panel is very well placed to examine these issues from a larger point of view, as also to touch on the 6 principles of quality infrastructure investment, and 2 of which are very directly related to integrating environmental considerations and managing risks to disasters. But beyond that, also in the context of positively impacting sustainable growth and development, and also looking at issues of governance. Having said that, at the Asian Development Bank, we have developed very robust systems for integrating such risks at the project level to address environmental and social outcomes. This includes our climate risk management framework. It includes our integrated disaster risk management framework, and also the safeguard policies. But as the title of this session suggests, we want to go beyond the project level risks to risks at the systems level, and also to ensure that these risks are addressed at the upstream level, at the decision making, when we are talking about planning and designing our systems, rather than downstream at the project level. And in that context, it is my hope that the panelists will touch on 3 very important elements related to upstream decision making, which is to ensure that there's no locking in of risks, especially given the long design nature of the transport infrastructure. Secondly, as I said before, looking at risks from a systems level rather than a project level. And third, looking at co-benefits, be it related to climate mitigation, addressing impacts of climate through adaptation, or through environmental co-benefits. So let me stop here with my opening remarks and introduce to you the eminent panelists who have very kindly agreed to give us their time for this discussion, and I'll introduce them in the chronological order of their presentations. First with us is Ms. Juliet Mian, who is the Deputy Executive Director of Resilience Shift, and also an Associate Director at Arup Consultants. She's also the UK representative to World Safety Roads Association. And she has particularly indicated her interest in behavioral change for those working in the critical infrastructure sector, which is a very, very important dimension if we have to reimagine and repurpose our systems. Next, we have Mr. Norris Dodd. Let me introduce all the speakers in one go so that we have an ease in sequencing the presentations. So next we have Mr. Norris Dodd, who has over 40 years of experience in natural resource management, research, and administration. And he is widely renowned international wildlife and biodiversity consultant who is currently overseeing the design and construction of green infrastructure for Asian elephants, for Bengal tigers, and the one-horned rhinos, and also is a third-party monitor for projects in Bangladesh and Nepal. He's also supporting ADB in its efforts to bring in environmental resilience in our infrastructure investments. Next, our panelist is Ms. Anna Bing Fonua. She is the coordinator for the Transport Project Development Facility for the Nuku'alofa port in Tonga. She is supporting the preparations for the upgrade of this port as well as the Fanga'uta Lagoon Bridge, including work related to feasibility studies, detailed designs, and bidding for the project. And she has also served as the Chief Executive Officer of the Ministry of Internal Affairs in the government of Tonga. So as you can see, we have varied experience expressed in the panels. Next, let me introduce my colleague Sujata Gupta, who is the Director of East Asia Sustainable Infrastructure Division at the Asian Development Bank. Since joining ADB in 2003, she has worked both in the private sector operations and public sector operations, and she has also been responsible for mobilizing additional resources from donor partners for ADB. And in her climate credentials, she has been a member of the methodology panel for the Clean Development Mechanism of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. And she has also contributed to the different assessments undertaken by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And last but not the least, let me introduce Mr. Sandeep Pondrik, who is the Director General for the recently launched Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure in India. Though India took the initiative to launch this coalition, it has an international interface as well, with many countries supporting this initiative. Mr. Pondrik is an officer of the Indian Administrative Services, having worked in the service for 25 years. And at the national level, he has been intimately involved with the Ministry of Petroleum and Natural Gas in India, as well as the Disaster Management Authority of India. And at the state level, he has worked in different infrastructure sectors, including urban development and the energy sector. And he has also been associated with the Global Fund for Disaster Reduction and Recovery, hosted by the World Bank. So as you can see, we have a cumulative experience to deal with the subject at hand. And now let me hand it over to our first speaker, Ms. Juliet Mian, for her presentation. Juliet, over to you.
Thank you very much, Preety, and good morning, everybody. I'm delighted to be here with such an eminent panel. I'm joining you from the UK. It's a dark and stormy night over here, but I think my connectivity is working and will be resilient. And any time of the day, I'm always happy to join a discussion about the importance of systems thinking and resilient infrastructure. So if I can start with my first slide, please. I just wanted to give a few points of introduction about the resilience shift. Some of you may have heard of us, but we're a fairly new initiative. So the resilience shift has the vision and mission. Sorry, if I can just go back to the opening slide, just the logo for the resilience shift. we have been established to accelerate a shift in practice to more resilient infrastructure. The founding partners for the Resilient Shift are Arup, where I also work as an engineering resilience practitioner, and the Lloyd's Register Foundation, who are providing the funding. So at the Resilient Shift, we've been working over the past couple of years to create and share knowledge and tools and information, working in partnership and collaboration with a number of organisations around the world who share the same vision. And in the context of today's session, this the sort of key topic of moving upstream, emerging stronger. Since the sort of early days of the Resilient Shift, we've now been in existence for 3.5 years. One of the really important ways of working that we've identified to create this shift in practice is to work across the value chain to make sure that we're influencing those who are from policy through to financing, through to design, delivery, and also downstream to operations and maintenance, asset management. We do believe that the change in practice will only happen if we're influencing across that entire value chain for critical infrastructure. There's something I think very important, yes, around moving upstream, but also creating this golden thread that connects all the decision makers required to, plan, deliver, design critical infrastructure. So if I can move to my second slide, which my slides are really just for sort of background information. So just there as context, but just to sort of present a bit of the international perspective. So the Resilient Shift is a global initiative. I'm based in the UK. We have our executive director, Seth Schultz, is based out of the US. And we've done a lot of work with colleagues in Australia as well. One of the early reports we did was around the role of public policy on influencing critical infrastructure resilience. I'm sure, unsurprisingly really to all of you in the audience, that report, one of the conclusions, at least that I took away from that, is there is no silver bullet. There's no one single magical solution to the public policy that's going to create more resilient infrastructure. There are numerous examples of best practice where policy interventions have made a difference, but across the geographies that we all work in and across the different infrastructure sectors that we're working in, these solutions don't all look the same. I also wanted to sort of mention one example of good practice, and I'm happy to provide the link if anyone is interested or isn't aware. The Institute of Civil Engineers in the UK published a report right at the end of 2019 around the sort of key ingredients of an enabling environment. So what's required, not prescriptive, but some of the important ingredients for an enabling environment for good infrastructure. Good meaning resilient, sustainable, low carbon infrastructure. So I think mentioning the Institute of Civil Engineers, the role of the professional institutions that kind of guide the practice where all of us work, again, across the whole value chain, is really important. And by background, I am a civil engineer. I'm very proud of being a civil engineer, but I also think there is a change in our profession needed. This issue of moving upstream is really important. We as engineers, I think, shouldn't just design and deliver what we're asked to deliver, but we need to provide our technical advice to influence the upstream decisions so that by the time it reaches the sort of technical design solutions, we're designing what we all believe is the right thing. A change, an important sort of change in thinking, and Preety's already talked about this in the introduction, is not what the infrastructure is. So to take a simple example, not thinking about a bridge, but thinking about the function that bridge is providing for communities. So the role of the bridge in connecting people, connecting communities, providing access for goods and services is actually what's important about the bridge. And I'm saying, as a civil engineer, I do love a nice bridge, but I think there's something important around the function of the bridge. So we need to always be thinking about the roles of our projects and individual assets that we're designing in the wider system, and how those projects are positively impacting the resilience of the wider system. The technical input is really important to this. One sort of contribution that we've started as the Resilience Shift is we're a founding organisation in an initiative called the International Coalition for Sustainable Infrastructure. The role of, so we call it ICSI, the ICSI, so the role of ICSI is really exactly around this, providing the connection between the engineers. We're working with the American Society of Civil Engineers, a number of private sector firms, also city leaders, the Global Covenant of Mayors, providing this technical advice further upstream into this city-led decision making. The image on the right, the anticipate, react, recover, I just wanted to mention, so government bodies who work across infrastructure sectors, I think are really critical to this systems thinking. I'm sure one of the challenges we all see is that when there are departments for transport and departments for water, departments for energy, we very, even at a very sort of high policy level, upstream thinking, we're already in siloed decision making. So in the UK for the past 4 or 5 years, there's been a government body called the National Infrastructure Commission. There are other bodies around the world, but they're not present in every single country. But the important thing about the National Infrastructure Commission, or the infrastructure bodies in Australia being another example, is they do have this, they have two things. They have a cross-sectoral remit, so they're working across the key economic infrastructure sectors, and they have a longer term view than sort of government organisations do. So the remit of the NIC is to look at our infrastructure solutions in the UK for over the next 30 years. And I think that's really important, because they are a body who therefore has the potential to look at the entire system, to analyse the system. So the NIC undertake a national infrastructure assessment every 4 years, and therefore from the very upstream position to be able to determine which interventions, which projects, whether they be transport, road, rail, whether they might actually be connectivity, providing improved 5G networks around the country. They are planning that in a sort of systems of systems thinking, after which it will cascade down as it needs to the individual departments, to the specialist engineers who are designing and delivering those. So if I could move on to my next slide, please, Michelle, thank you. There's moving from thinking about the policy, but also how do we really embed the important aspects of systems thinking into practice. I do believe, in the work that we've done at the Resilience Shift demonstrates that improved decisions arise when the multiple stakeholders who are involved in a system are engaged from an early stage in the decision making. One of the examples I have here is the slide in the middle is the City Water Resilience Assessment, and I know that this is a transportation forum, but there is a reason for me putting that there. I'm not just going completely off topic, because I think there's, again, thinking about the systems of systems approach, there's something very important about transferring lessons, what works from one sector to another, not to sort of reinvent a wheel from the beginning in a new sector. So we've done some work in the water sector, and in the Resilience Shift, we're looking hard at what we can learn from that. Not everything's transferable, but some things are transferable into other sectors. So a city water catchment is an example of a system that includes multiple stakeholders, public and private sector stakeholders, natural and built assets, and the communities that use them. And one of the key parts of the City Water Resilience Assessment methodology is to engage with all of those stakeholders from an early stage, such that when the interventions that will enhance the resilience of that system are sort of shortlisted, everybody has bought into them to give a much improved chance of success when those interventions are put into place. Because again, when the governance and the stakeholders who are involved in a system are very fragmented, that we've all learned can lead directly to a lack of resilience. So that's not necessarily the physical resilience of that system, but how the different stakeholders, people responsible for decision making, respond when a crisis or disaster hits. We at the Resilience Shift are now looking at applying similar thinking, similar methodologies to ports, which is a really exciting sort of piece of work that we've just started. Ports are needing at the moment to transform fairly rapidly to meet the needs of a low carbon future, both in shipping and transportation and in terms of the ports themselves. And there's a need to engage much more widely than just the port operator itself to ensure that this transformation of ports is also going to be resilient, not only to meet some of the, to meet the net zero targets for shipping and cities. So we would be engaging with the cities, with the cities where ports are, with shipping operators, with land transport agencies, local communities, and bringing that diverse group of stakeholders together to truly understand their system and what's needed for that system to be resilient. So if I can move on to the final slide, please, Michelle, thanks. So the theme or the title of this session is around emerging stronger. So just to pick up on the very important and topical issue of what we can and will be learning from the COVID-19 crisis. I think we will have all seen that COVID-19 has impacted every part of the transportation systems that we're all sort of working in. And one of the reasons that there are so many important lessons that we can pull from this is that it's not a physical shock. And quite often when we are talking about resilience and climate resilience, we're thinking of the extreme weather events, that, you know, the sort of physical things and how they are impacting our transportation systems. Taking away the physical shock has enabled us to see really clearly just how important the people within the systems are, and whether that's the sort of very high level leadership decisions are being made down to the decisions that communities and users are making. So we've been looking at the Resilience Shift around at the topic of resilient leadership. What can we learn from the current crisis to capture, and that not necessarily to capture policy, or as you know, as I said before, what the silver bullet, what works, you know, what's the one thing you need to do to be a resilient leader, or even we're not learning from this so much the characteristics of the system for which these leaders were responsible, but the great insights that we're pulling out of this particular project is around the behaviors that emerge. So the importance of leaders within our infrastructure decision making, having emotional resilience, being able to make decisions in times of deep uncertainty, and adapting and changing as this crisis continues. So we've been running a project over the past 3 or 4 months. We started it early on in the crisis, certainly from the UK, US, probably 3 weeks after we all locked down, engaging with both city leaders and executive level business leaders on a weekly basis to understand really what they're going through, and to try and extract from that some insights around what's working well for resilient leadership, and also what's not working well. There's always an important part of resilience which is about reflection, you know, what worked, what didn't work. It's been an amazing project. I'm happy to provide the link in the chat afterwards to anyone who's interested to our website. We've been sharing weekly podcasts, and I think one of the great things that has emerged from this is the importance of honesty in leadership, making mistakes because these current times are so uncertain that people will, but also admitting that, recognizing that, adapting and sharing. So I think one of the sort of lessons that has come out of this is we've been talking for a long time in our sort of specialist area around resilience about the deep uncertainty that we're all facing in the future. And that's a difficult concept to grasp. And I think COVID has maybe helped us explain, sorry, I'm just wrapping up on my last slide. So it's helped us to explain the, the reality of uncertainty, because at the moment we don't know what's happening, over the next couple of months even. So that was it really. I think just to close, there are some important examples of good practice internationally. We do need to think hard about how we can introduce whole systems thinking into our infrastructure decision making. And the final point of making sure we're learning from good practice in other sectors, focusing on the transportation sector that we're all interested in, but pulling in what's worked elsewhere. So thank you. Apologies for running over time, Preety.
Thank you, Juliet. I didn't interrupt because you were making some very, very excellent points. And I like the way you ended on, the need for emotional resilience in decision-making, in leadership in these uncertain times, apart from all the other valuable interventions you made related to, not only looking at upstream, but the entire value chain and learning from our experiences. So thank you for this wonderful, setting for the subsequent speakers, the overview that you have provided. Let's move on to our next presenter, which is Mr. Norris Dodd. And he will be giving you a completely different perspective on how green infrastructure is essential also in the context of managing our natural resources, our wildlife and biodiversity. Over to you, Norris.
Thank you, Preety. Good evening to everybody. I just wanted to add a little bit to the introduction that she provided and just mention that I have consulted for ADB for approximately 6 years now, and I've seen a sea change in attitudes and progress in being able to proactively incorporate measures to conserve biodiversity into transport projects. We've also seen a shift to doing a lot of capacity building, and I've been very excited to participate in that, including today. Michelle, may I have my first slide? Thank you. So again, it's a sincere pleasure to be joining you today to speak about upstream actions for biodiversity and wildlife conservation with transport projects. Transport infrastructure, especially highways, constitute one of the most significant forces impacting biodiversity in the world. Next slide, please. Impacts can be direct and indirect in nature, including direct loss of habitats during construction. Trains and vehicles cause direct impact from collisions with all wildlife taxa, leading to declines in population viability. But the most pervasive impacts are indirect barrier effects that can totally preclude animals from crossing highways and railways. These barrier effects fragment habitats into smaller and smaller blocks, reducing landscape connectivity and isolating wildlife populations. This habitat fragmentation can lead to wildlife declines and genetic isolation. The most severe impacts are realized in roadless and protected areas where new roads can be a gateway to biodiversity loss if they're not properly planned. Next slide, please. Yet, transport infrastructure is essential to economic development across Asia. The good news is that transport infrastructure impacts can be lessened greatly with proven and effective actions and measures, especially when they are applied early or upstream in the transport project planning process. Next slide. I will touch on these key upstream actions and measures that, when applied collectively, can result in projects that are sensitive to the environment and allow us to balance transport infrastructure with biodiversity conservation. Next slide. Adherence to policies such as ADB's Safeguard Policy Statement and the International Finance Corporation's Performance Standard 6 serve as the foundation to sound project planning. These policies provide clear expectations for evaluating project risks and achieving environmental compliance. Next slide. Biodiversity conservation and landscape corridor planning at the regional, national, and corridor-specific levels provide identification of important conservation areas for use in project planning. These plans help identify potential zones of conflict that can be proactively addressed through project development. Next slide. Biodiversity baseline assessments are often required for projects in high biodiversity areas. The conduct of early and thorough studies can yield invaluable information that quantifies project impacts and then supports data-driven strategies to lessen these impacts. Transport project development is where the upstream actions are put into motion. Next slide. There we go. The mitigation hierarchy is a long-established step-by-step process for addressing environmental impacts, and it is especially appropriate for projects in high biodiversity areas. The first and most important step should always focus on avoidance of impacts where possible, which is especially important for projects with critical habitats for endangered species, legally protected areas, as well as areas not suited to construction, such as steep slopes with high risk and unstable soils. However, when full avoidance of impacts is not possible, next slide, green infrastructure can be effective in mitigating transport impacts. ADB recognized the critical need for a set of guidelines specific to Asia well over 5 years ago, and the guidelines were just recently published after much hard work. These guidelines incorporate the best available science in a comprehensive set of best practices for transportation mitigation. They help consultants and transport agencies alike establish sound recommendations for mitigations. Next slide. Such as for wildlife passage structures, which are the most effective green infrastructure measure in preventing wildlife collisions and barrier effects. They're also the most expensive. Next slide. These passage structure guidelines provide recommendations for the full range of wildlife taxa, small to very large in size and mobility, with corresponding structure sizes and spacing distances. These guidelines establish clear and objective standards for meeting passage structure needs for a variety of target species. Given the high cost of passage structures, the guidelines advocate for cost-effective integration with other infrastructure functions. Proper sized and designed drainage structures can serve as effective dual-use underpasses at modest additional cost. Next slide. And small drainage structures in Asia are subject to blowouts from increasingly frequent extreme weather events. Oversizing structures to better accommodate higher flows can prevent costly repairs and disruptions to commerce, while better incorporating wildlife passage via cost-effective dual-use structures. Also, cost-effective prefabricated designs are now increasingly available for transport projects, as well as retrofitting of existing infrastructure to address spot biodiversity conflicts outside of transport projects. Next slide. While not necessarily being an upstream action, post-construction monitoring with dedicated funding is nonetheless very important. The information from camera monitoring of Bhutan's 4 largest new underpasses that found that elephants readily use them helped bring about a rapid evolution in awareness and acceptance of green infrastructure across Asia. Monitoring is essential to support continuous improvement of design guidelines, as well as sharing the success stories that promote further acceptance and future use of green infrastructure. Next slide. And lastly, the effective application of the upstream actions are greatly enhanced with capacity building and technical support, which ADB has aggressively pursued the last 3 years and continues today, of course, to foster awareness and action for biodiversity conservation in transport projects. Next slide. So thank you.
Thank you, Norris, and thank you for ending on an optimistic note as well. While you have highlighted the direct and indirect impacts focusing on habitat fragmentation, you also highlighted how green infrastructure could be designed to minimize these impacts or mitigate them, and the art of the possible. So thank you so much for this presentation. Now let's move over to the next presentation by Ms. Anna Bing Fonua on the Nuku'alofa port. I think we're going to start with a video of the project before Anna takes up presents. So over to you, Anna.
The Kingdom of Tonga, situated in the southern Pacific Ocean, is an archipelago of 177 islands set across an expanse of 700,000 square kilometers of ocean. The population of 108,000 has a strong seafaring tradition, and current and future trade plans rely heavily on sea trade to develop the economy. Currently, the kingdom's economy is based on a large non-monetary sector, remittances from foreign-based nationals, fishing and agricultural exports. Tonga's development plans emphasize a growing private sector, upgrading agricultural productivity, developing tourism and improving communications and transport. Substantial progress has been made, but much work remains to be done. The current port container terminal at Queen Salote International Wharf is the lifeline of the remote island country of Tonga and has been identified as a bottleneck to future development.
Queen Salote Wharf is the capital international port for Tonga.
This is the only gateway, for this island. We only have one international wharf. Currently, when the ship are arriving at the ports, the berthing is too short. We need a longer berth for the container ship coming to Tonga.
Knowing that there will be larger ships operating in the Pacific Islands in the future, the Queen Salote International Port needs to be improved and upgraded to be able to accommodate those ships in the future.
With widespread degradation of the wharf facilities, a decaying concrete structure, insufficient lighting and substandard safety and hard stand provisions, the Asian Development Bank is working with the Government of Tonga for the provision of grant funding for the redesign and construction of an upgraded container port facility. Additionally, natural hazards such as cyclones, earthquakes and tsunamis pose a significant threat to the port container terminal and the achievement of national and regional development goals. The target of this upgrade is not only to modernize the facility, but as well to climate-proof the port in order to become an international gateway, promoting the economic development of Tonga. The upgrade of the port is proposed to start construction in 2021, with activities expected to be ongoing for 2 to 4 years. The main features of the project include the extension of Wharf 2 to better accommodate larger vessels, construction of a new dolphin between Wharf 1 and 2, construction of new dolphins on the eastern side of Wharf 1, reconstruction of the Wharf 1 reinforced concrete slab, yard improvements and smart and green port features such as reorganization, new paving, drainage, smart lighting, waste management and firefighting. capacity building programs related to port operations, safety, operation and maintenance, and gender equity policy and training for the Ports Authority.
The hope for the Quinsalod International Wharf project is that it will improve provisions of better facilities for trade, and then it will increase the economy contribution from the transport sector, as well as provide sustainability of development here in Tonga.
After this project, if we will get more ships coming and we have more transshipment containers, we have more spaces for empty containers. Hopefully, we will get more additional revenue, for my country, stimulating our economy of my islands.
Thank you, Preety. And maloilele and greetings, warm greetings from the Kingdom of Tonga. On behalf of the Government of Tonga and specifically Ministry of Infrastructure, Tonga is happy to participate in today's panel. In terms of the Nuku'alofa Port Upgrade Project, at the moment it is at 80% completion of the detailed engineering design, and the landfall of Tropical Cyclone Harold in April of this year was very timely for the design team to pick up and consider some of the lessons learned from the Tropical Cyclone Harold. In terms of disaster resilience and measures put in place in the design of the Nuku'alofa Port Upgrade Project, it includes the raise of the yard level by 0.5 meters. It includes the raise of a seawall defense to provide a concrete wave barrier to the exposed side of the yard on the eastern side. The site power supply is underground and buried as part of a climate-proof approach to avoid overhead power line damages, and this is done in close consultation with Tonga Power Limited. The substation, the new substation, is being raised with generators, including a top floor in case of tsunamis, and this is for improved post-disaster responses. The firefighting system with backup pumps is being designed in close consultation with Tonga Fire and Emergency Services. I mentioned this just to re-emphasize what Juliet had mentioned about designing in close consultation with other stakeholders and implementing agencies to avoid silo. There's a new drainage system designed for higher rainfall with spare outlets and grading of pavements. In terms of road access, there is a new road access surfacing and drainage. This includes additional drain and outlets, and it is done in close consultation with Land Transport Division. The new structures is designed to withstand higher wind speed, wave heights, and earthquakes. And the reefer towers and reorganization of the yard includes new lashing procedures to avoid container damages. In April this year, during Tropical Cyclone Harold, some of the empty containers drifted about 400 meters from the wharf yard onto the main road, and this would help hold them down. In terms of green ports, there's a new electrical system and site supply to improve efficiency, new freshwater system and site supply to improve efficiency as well. There's new LED lighting with different levels of lighting to reduce consumption. Rainwater is being gathered on water tanks to reduce water consumption from the main water supply. The new pavement surface reduces fuel consumption and maintenance of tires and of yard equipment. New oil separators are being installed to include separating storm water, which is designed for the stormwater design to minimize pollution release at sea. There's a new washdown area with runoff water collection to minimize pollution off the ground. And there's a new fuel water tank with double hull to prevent leakages with fuel consumption monitoring. In terms of environmentally sensitive features, in Tonga, between the months of August and November, we have the humpback whales. Their migration patterns comes across the Tonga waters during these months with breeding season, and there are mitigation measures in place during the construction phase, especially underwater construction, so that the sound waves are being monitored very closely during the migration period. The marine ecology considerations are being put in place as part of the EIA because there is dredging involved as well. For climate change resilience and climate proofing, the fenders and the mooring systems are being upgraded to reduce rolling and damage from sea level rise. In terms of institutional measures, in terms of upstreaming, the Secretariat of the South Pacific, or SPC, we have adopted the Green Port approach with some of the components I have just explained. The institutional framework and existing one at the moment is there's a National Emergency Monitoring and Management Committee at the highest level of government, and they use the cluster system approach, where the transport sector as well is one of them. They have clusters such as the social protection, WASH cluster, infrastructure, food security cluster, shelter cluster, and within this institutional arrangement, there are standard operating procedures that are starting to being developed, and it is timely that this forum provides the opportunity to share good practices internationally and within the region. Just to conclude, there are also early warning systems put in place with assistance from the government of Japan, and this is done on a nationwide approach. And the project has incorporated this into the project so that it can, so they can use the resources that is available to strengthen the resilience of the designs that have been in place and use existing programs as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Anna, and thank you for giving a very, very practical example, a good practice from your country, where you have, built you're building a resilient infrastructure, but taking into account the wider system, impacts as well. Looking at the land infrastructure, and I was very happy to hear about, also taking care of the marine ecology in this context, and also the standards and procedures that you are setting into motion. So thank you for your presentation, and let me now request the next speaker, which is Sujata Gupta from ADB, to take the floor. Sujata, over to you.
Thank you, Preety. I think we've had some very good presentations, and some of these have dwelt on what ADB is doing. I'm going to also look at this problem and see what ADB and MDBs in general can do to assist with this problem. So ensuring environmental sustainability, disaster, and climate resilience in transport projects is a very critical issue, no doubt, but it's also a very challenging issue. So first, as you also mentioned, Preety, in your introduction, and others have mentioned, Juliet, that we have to recognize the problem and to mainstream climate and disaster risk resilience upstream It's not a single project. It's not a single sector that is under consideration, but it's an integration of different sectors. And each sector is guided by its own priorities. And actually, we would be lucky if we find that there is an overall sector strategy. So very often, even within the sector, there is a piecemeal approach, and the focus is more at a project level. So what we need is a systems planning and integrated planning. The second issue is the issue of resources, both financial and human. So even if there were sufficient human resources, resulting in an integrated plan, all aspects or all components of this plan cannot be implemented at the same time, given the financial constraints. So given these challenges, how can we address these ground realities? Let me take the example of Mongolia. In Mongolia, the urban network, road network, has worsened as a result of high traffic volume, funding gaps in maintenance, and significant flood events. In the sector, increased precipitation events over the last 3 years have caused significant damage to the road network. And just to illustrate this, in 2018 and 19, 50% and 37% respectively of the city road maintenance budget was reallocated from routine maintenance to significant rehabilitation works due to serious damage from these rainfall events. So this has long-term impacts on reducing the overall sustainability of the network, but also reduces funding available for expansion, which is also needed in these growing economies. Further, the newly built drainage systems are already failing. So what is required is design standards for drainage capacity for both urban and rural roads to be updated to incorporate increased rainfall events due to a change or as a result of climate change. Single projects which would employ these improved standards are good, but this needs to be done in conjunction with institutional measures, such as improvements to design standards and capacity development for design, engineering, and design audit departments. So design standards and adequate capacity will reduce the burden required for major rehabilitation works and improve overall asset management sustainability. Actually, we could go one step further, and in addition to enhancing the standards, develop a strategic transport master plan, which considers building resilience in the network. And this would include consideration of different elements to improve the overall transport system's performance, like accessibility, reducing congestion, while also achieving the sustainable development objectives, which would be improved resilience, inclusion of ecological design elements. So ideally, what we need is an overall policy framework integrating the roles and responsibilities of different ministries and departments, a sector master plan, and then design standards for specific projects. Now, to do all this is very challenging. Firstly, enhancing and disaster-proofing the transport sector requires extensive risk assessment, detailed hazard mapping, and a consultation across different stakeholders. This becomes even difficult because different agencies have different capacities even within a country. Then data on hazards, exposure, and vulnerability remains a challenge. Very often there is little or no guidance on standardized approaches and how to commence on these upstream actions. These are not really available, or they're not widely available. So long-term strategic actions and doing this planning also generates a delay. So in developing countries, short on infrastructure capacity, there is a pressure of time. And to top it all, there are higher costs, plus higher immediate costs, not long-term costs. As we can see, the current crisis of the COVID is also focusing attention away from other important issues to combating the immediate problem. But all we can say is proper planning, resilient transport systems equip us better to combat such situations. For example, having reliable supply chains. So as an example, let me give you what ADB is doing. And again, this is not so in the transport sector, but looking at building urban resilience in Myanmar, in Mandalay. It's providing capacity building, demonstration projects, training local planners in urban resilience assessment, and establishing an urban management database that will inform future urban investments and decision-making processes. All the project activities are based on a long-term view of building urban resilience. Now coming to the role of MDBs and how MDBs can assist. Well, MDBs can assist with studies to assess local climate, natural hazards, and ecology to inform and better understand risks and identify resilient investment priorities. Of course, as I said earlier, and as was referred to in terms of what is being done in Tonga, such studies require close consultation and collaboration with the DMCs across a wide range of ministries, sectors, compatibility with plans, and also other stakeholders like the private sector. So, as other speakers have said, we need to adopt a systems approach which looks beyond the physical assets and incorporates users' needs, including those of vulnerable groups. And we need to be guided by national commitments and roadmaps under global frameworks, such as the Paris Agreement and the Sendai Framework, to steer upstream actions to develop resilient project pipelines. What is ADB doing as an example of this? In the PRC, which amongst our member countries has more capacity, we are developing a project in Shantan. It's the Low Carbon Transformation Project. And here we adopt a sector development program approach or modality. So there is a policy component as well as project components. The project adopts an integrated systems approach that will demonstrate transformations in infrastructure, integrating transport sector, buildings, energy, and climate resilient solutions, which is complemented by information and knowledge system. The policy-based loan will reinforce the project components through reforms and promote low carbon behavior by creating an enabling environment and appropriate incentives. For example, design guides to promote low carbon actions and technical standards. Some of the project components related to the transport sector include safe and seamless access across different modes of transport. So this will promote public modes of transportation. There is an urban catchment management plan for 3 flood-prone areas in Shantan, using ecosystem-based adaptation, that is using nature-based solutions, for example, for water retention and flood control, and early warning systems and risk-sensitive land use planning. There is the use of ICT technology, not only for traffic management and public transport, but also for intelligent flood warning systems. Further, in my view, I would like to share with you what instruments are available within ADB that can assist.
May I ask you to wind up soon, please?
Yes, I will, Preety. ADB can help. We have the initiatives such as the NDC Advance, which can support countries in identifying such upstream needs and help develop a resilient pathway. So under NDC Advance, there are technical assistance for low carbon and climate resilient development, focusing on finance, technology, as well as knowledge and capacity building. There are other trust funds within ADB, which is the Urban Climate Change Resilience Trust Fund, which can help to pilot upstream resilience. And once these resilience priorities are identified, ADB, through its country partnership strategies, provides a key entry point for operationalizing these findings and to engage with DMCs in a beyond project dialogue and building a pipeline of investments that contribute to resilience. Thank you. I'll stop here.
Thank you, Sujata, and thank you for highlighting that we need to take an overall systems approach despite the challenges of capacity, costs, and data and time. And also giving the examples from the People's Republic of China, the Shantan example, and the example from Myanmar on how ADB has been supporting this shift and what are the different avenues through which ADB could provide that support to our developing members. Let me now move on to our last panelist, last but not the least. Sandeep, over to you. And I believe you're starting with a video.
That's correct.
Resilient infrastructure is critical for people's well-being, quality of life, and economic prospects, irrespective of where they live. Inadequate and poorly built infrastructure blocks economic and social development. Increasing exposure to earthquakes, floods, and tropical cyclones stresses infrastructure systems. 2/3 of total economic losses in disasters are associated with infrastructure damage. As extreme weather events become more frequent and intense due to climate change, these losses are set to rise. The impact on small island developing nations and least developed countries is particularly severe. Disaster and climate resilient infrastructure is essential to the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals and to accelerate climate action. $94 trillion of global investment is needed to fill the infrastructure deficit by 2040. More infrastructure will be built in the next 20 years than in the last 200 years. Fortunately, achieving disaster and climate resilient infrastructure is not expensive. $1 invested in strengthened resilience generates $4 in avoided economic and social. is critical for people's well-being, quality of life, and economic prospects, irrespective of where they live. Inadequate and poorly built infrastructure blocks economic and social development. Increasing exposure to earthquakes, floods, and tropical cyclones stresses infrastructure systems. 2/3 of total economic losses in disasters are associated with infrastructure damage. As extreme weather events become more frequent and intense due to climate change, these losses are set to rise. The impact on small island developing nations and least developed countries is particularly severe. Disaster and climate resilient infrastructure is essential to the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals and to accelerate climate action. $94 trillion of global investment is needed to fill the infrastructure deficit by 2040. More infrastructure will be built in the next 20 years than in the last 200 years. Fortunately, achieving disaster and climate resilient infrastructure is not expensive. $1 invested in strengthened resilience generates $4 in avoided economic and social losses. The Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure is an international partnership that will support countries to build the disaster and climate resilient infrastructure they need. Championed by global leaders, CDRI will provide knowledge, technical support, and capacity development to those countries with the greatest infrastructure challenges. Join us to achieve the SDGs and accelerate climate action by making all new infrastructure disaster and climate resilient.
So thank you, Preety. It's a pleasure to be here in this forum, and thank you for inviting CDRI to present its perspective on the upstream action in the transport sector. Can we have the presentation, please? Thank you. So CDRI, next slide, please. CDRI is a multi-stakeholder partnership of governments, multilateral development banks, UN agencies, private sector, and knowledge institutions. It was launched by Prime Minister of India in the Climate Action Summit in New York in September 2019. So it's almost a year now. And till now, 16 countries and 3 international organizations have already joined the coalition, and Argentina, Peru, and Asian Development Bank have endorsed the charter of CDRI. So now we have 22 members, including 4 international organizations. The Governing Council meeting of CDRI was held in March 2020 under the chair of United Kingdom and India, and many important decisions were taken in the Governing Council meeting, including a 3-year work plan, which was approved. The focus or priorities of CDRI for these 3 years are in 3 sectors: power, telecom, and transport, which is the subject matter of discussion today. The CDRI Secretariat is based in New Delhi, and if you see the bottom of the slide, many countries from Asia, Europe, North America, Oceania, Africa have already joined, and we are expecting that many more countries and organizations will join the coalition to increase climate and disaster resilience of infrastructure in the world. Next slide, please. Now coming to the CDRI's mission, priorities, and what are the main work plan components so to achieve this mission and priorities. So first mission of CDRI is to increase the availability of technical knowledge and improve the capacity of institutions. Towards this, CDRI will be conducting many studies, in all the sectors of infrastructure resilience, and will focus on how to build back better after a disaster takes place. Disaster risk financing will be one of the important area which will be worked into, and improving the governance systems, standards, and certifications. So all the upstream actions which are needed to increase the disaster resilience of infrastructure, CDRI will be working as one of its priority in its work plan. The second priority of CDRI is research and knowledge management. So CDRI will work as a knowledge platform among academic institutions, countries, and institutions for collaborative research, for practical research on disaster DRI problems. And CDRI will be releasing every 2 year, a flagship report on disaster resilience of infrastructure. So it will be similar to the Human Development Report or the GAR report every 2 years, but this will focus only on disaster resilience of infrastructure. And CDRI will make a platform which will be a global database of infrastructure and resilience parameters. Towards doing this, we will be conducting studies for learning from disasters, as well as on technical standards and certifications. CDRI will be focusing on promoting innovation in this sector through various programs. CDRI is going to soon launch a fellowship program where CDRI will be giving fellowships to researchers to work on the DRI problems. And the third priority of CDRI will be to increase awareness, advocacy, partnerships. CDRI is conducting conferences. In fact, we have conducted 2 international workshops on disaster resilience of infrastructure in 2018 and 19. 2020 could not be conducted because of COVID, but we will be conducting such conferences to promote disaster resilience of infrastructure. And there will be programs like Resilience Challenge to promote innovation. Next slide, please. Now coming to the topic of transportation, which we are discussing today. So as I said, CDRI is working primarily on 3 sectors in the first 3 years: power, telecom, and transportation. And in the transportation sector, the first initiative CDRI has taken is a global study on disaster resilience of airports. So as all of us are aware, that aviation industry contributes to about 3.6% of global GDP and gives about 66 million jobs, out of which 9 million are at the airports. So this is one of the most critical infrastructures in the transport sector. So we will be conducting a study to research on different aspects of airport resilience. So starting from land use planning to life cycle risks to transient population, because the population which is in the airports, they are not based there. So the risk due to that, large spaces, typical constructions, and what is the role of airports in a systems issue. So it's not individual airports, but systems. Some airports are hub airports. So how does that affect the risk of infrastructure? So all these issues will be discussed. We have already held 2 international consultations with all the stakeholders, and we will be launching this study soon. Next slide, please. CDRI will be, the scope of work of this study will be type of airports. We will select a few airports. So we will be first conducting a survey of about 125 to 150 airports worldwide. We are in touch with all the aviation associations, ICAO, ITA, and other stakeholders. And depending on the type of hazards, multi-hazard scenarios. We will be then selecting 8 to 10 airports for an in-depth study of airports, and then we will come out with a set of recommendations for all the airports on how to make the airports more resilient. So for example, if you see the COVID-19 scenario which is going on, the risk which has come to airports from this COVID-19, probably nobody would have thought about it because it's an operational risk, a systems risk. So it has not come, as some speakers said earlier, it has not come due to any physical hazard, but because of the large number of screenings needed at the airports, or the space is needed to screen those people. So all these issues we will be studying in the airport study. Next slide, please. So what is the new normal? This new term has come up now that we are going through a new normal. So some of the recommendations which we will be promoting is promotion of non-motorized transport, especially in urban areas, so that it's also climatically more sustainable. But in the present scenario, perhaps it will be a better option. Then reviving the confidence of people in the public transport by taking steps like sanitization, social distancing measures, active utilization of technology to reduce the contact, cashless and contactless systems, contact tracing. Some of the countries are already doing it. So increasing the confidence and awareness in the public, implement management measures. So advanced booking facilities, especially for road transport, so that people can plan their travel, and restructuring of agreements and finance systems because of the COVID-19 or similar hazards. The financiers or the investors may find it difficult to repay their loans in time. So how to restructure that financing instruments is one of the issues which can be discussed. And coming to the COVID-19 situation, I think even till February or mid-March 20, none of us would have really believed that world will come to such a scenario, what we are going through now. So what if something else, something else happens in the future? So the unforeseen risks which we have to be ready, our infrastructure, transportation infrastructure has to be ready about. So that will also have to be seen. Next slide, please. Now, a further set of recommendations, sustainable design and construction methods. So this has already been covered by many of the earlier speakers, that all the design and construction methods have to be sustainable, both from disaster resilience point of view, as well as from climate adaptation point of view, and renewable source of energy. But at the same time, as I saw, showed in one of the pictures, so one of the airports in India, Kochi airport, they went for a renewable sources of energy. However, all their solar panels had to be removed after a few years because they were getting affected by the floods, and all of the solar panels went underwater. So even when you are going for the renewable sources of energy, how to make those sources resilient to different kind of hazards is one issue which need to be tackled. Then performance-based technical standards, unless we adopt them, our systems, our infrastructure systems will not be that disaster resilient. Regulatory and legislative environment, I think, is the most critical component for ensuring upstream action. And if you see some of the issues which CDRI will be working on, so I will just mention 4 or 5 issues which, if you have seen the components, work components, so risk governance, then standards and certifications, learning from disasters, and promoting innovations. All of these issues or work components actually are addressing the upstream of all infrastructure sectors, including transportation. And we will be working with national governments, with multilateral institutions, with academic institutions to primarily address the upstream side of all infrastructure sectors, including transportation, so as to make all the sectors more disaster resilient. With this, thank you, Preety. Thank you for giving CDRI a chance to putting up its perspective. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sandeep, and thank you for highlighting what CDRI is planning, and also, you know, the importance of knowledge creation, dissemination, partnerships, and a global platform to take these initiatives forward, and also, you know, some of the features that you talked about in the new normal and future directions of CDRI on the upstream side. So thank you to all the panelists for some very wonderful insights on the subject. And we've harvested some questions from the audience. We have about 300 people who have joined this session, and my colleagues have helped me curate those questions. And if I could, you know, beg for the indulgence of all of you for going maybe a few minutes over time to be able to have this interactive dialogue between the participants who've joined us virtually and the panelists. So if I can start with the first question, which is addressed to Juliet, which is, you know, if you could provide an example of a best practice from your work at Resilience Shift. And of course, the participants have asked for specific sectors, and, you know, it goes across the board. But Juliet, if you could pick up one subsector of transport and give a best practice example, please.
Yeah, happy to. Thanks, Preety. And again, I can provide the conference organisers with some links, but some of the work we've done in Resilience Shift during 2018, 2019 was to produce a series of primers, which they were aiming to do exactly that, to pull out best practice in specific sectors. And I know I talk very passionately about the systems approach, but still at some point that needs to come down to sectors. So we looked at road, from the transportation point of view, we looked at road, rail and ports and what good looks like. I think there's some good examples of best practice in the rail sector. For example, one of the big challenges in many parts of the world is managing the existing infrastructure, because it's there already. And certainly this is a UK context, but it's relevant in many places. It's been there for 150 years. It certainly wasn't designed for the climate that it now has to operate in. So sometimes those real examples of decisions that, you know, infrastructure owner operators have made, I think can really help to scale up practice. And again, that was the objective of the primers. We know, and I imagine a lot of the audience here, you know, we know what good looks like, but what we need is for everybody to sort of bring that up to scale. So I'll send some links now, Preety, to some of those documents so that the conveners can share them. Moderators.
Juliet, thank you. And, you know, perhaps Sandeep may want to provide a link through his global platform as well to the primers that Resilience Shift is developing. So we're already seeing synergies between the panelists and the organizations taking place. The next question, if I may, is addressed to Norris. You know, the audience has appreciated the guidelines and principles that you highlighted for addressing the issues. But the question is, how do they translate into national policy, and how are they enforced? Enforcement is an important question when it comes to making these transformational shifts. And there is a second question also, Norris, addressed to you about transportation corridors, you know, and how can they be structured so that they shield and accommodate biodiversity? So there are two questions addressed to you. Over to you.
Thank you. So the answers to that will take longer to answer than my presentation, but I'll try to kind of hit the high points. The question about affecting national policies, before we get to enforcement is a really good question. And it's something that ADB and others have been focused on the last 2-3 years. And a lot of this is through education and capacity building. That's where that monitoring comes into, where we can show them tangible success stories and help them to understand that these things are important for the long-term sustainability of biodiversity. As I also mentioned, we need to stress that applying these principles need not be cost prohibitive. We can combine it with drainage structures and other measures so that it isn't prohibitively expensive. And that's a big thing to getting them to want to enact policies. And then we have to really stress, that the economic side of this is very important, the benefits to be derived from it, to biodiversity, tourism, as well as ecosystem services for many of their rural residents. Enforcement comes after a policy is put in place. If there's not ADB or other multilateral bank funding, then it's up to the countries to enact that through laws and policies and regulations. But getting them to understand the importance is the first step. The other question I'll answer very quickly, and I hit on a lot of these things. The biggest single thing that countries can be doing is do mapping, upfront mapping of sensitive areas, protected areas, biodiversity hotspots, and things along those lines. This will allow us to avoid conflicts early in the process and seek those really meaningful avoidance strategies. Often we think of avoidance after we realize late in the process that we've got a real conflict. The green infrastructure guidelines obviously were developed just for this purpose, to give us really good, if you will, best practices of how to design and implement green infrastructure to protect biodiversity. That's the easy part. The biggest part up front is let's do our best to minimize the conflicts.
Thank you, Norris.
Thank you.
Questions are streaming in. So the next one, maybe both Anna and Sujata could, respond to it. It's based on projects and economic analysis of projects. So, how are you ensuring, or how can we ensure that the economic analysis of projects builds in the resilience, premium, or builds that kind of a premium into the economic analysis of projects? Anna, would you like to start, and then I can hand it over to Sujata?
Okay, thank you. For the ports project, the incorporation into the port operation plan, as well as the disaster response plan, also links to a sustainability or maintenance commitment from government, so that whatever assets are being built, that the management of it and the periodic and routine maintenance would be able to be incorporated. So specifically for the ports project, there is a component of commitment from the borrower to be able to generate sufficient revenue to be able to cover for the maintenance costs, both periodic and routine, to ensure the sustainability of the infrastructure in the long term.
Sujata?
Yeah, thanks. This is a very difficult question, actually to implement, because if you look at any project, the investment is looked at more in financial terms. But infrastructure and transport projects have, as Anna said, one has to ensure the long-term sustainability of it. So I think information and educating the project developers, the system, the governments on aspects such as what was referred in the film, the clip that was shown by Sandeep, which said that $1 invested today saves $4 in future. I think that's the message that has to go out to the decision makers, the policy makers, and we need to mainstream economic analysis more to address these issues. Because if we let it alone, then there would be only, financial analysis that would be done. So what I can say is ADB and and other MDBs actually approve a project not only based on its financial viability, but also looking at the economic internal rate of return. Of course, this needs to be more mainstreamed in reality, in practice.
Thank you, Sujata. The next question, and I'll take up only two more questions now. The next question, if I may direct it to you, Sandeep, since you also talked about, the role of technology, in the context of COVID-19. And the question is, how can new and resilient technologies such as cashless payments, contact tracing, and e-vehicles be scaled up in an effective and practical manner? Is there some experience from India or elsewhere that you'd like to share?
Thank you, Preety. So as I said in my presentation, that role of technology during disasters or preventing disasters is increasing day by day. And as we have seen in COVID-19 in almost all the countries, that technology has been used to a large extent for contact tracing using the cell phones, including in India. It has been a very effective tool also for quarantine monitoring, that people are home quarantined or they are staying in their quarantine places, and also for other purposes. So similarly for transportation sector, if we see especially the new metros which have come in India and also in other countries, lot of new technologies are being used which encourage contactless transactions, and especially in developing countries, a lot of cash economy still is there. So the best way to promote this is to take COVID-19 as an example of how the transmission of COVID can happen because of all these physical transactions, but at the same time, any incentives for non-physical transactions in infrastructure as well as in daily operations. I think that can go a long way. And in India also, if you remember 2 years ago, I think a large push was given to non-physical transactions through mobile phones. That has also happened in many African countries and other developing countries. So it can be done through upstream actions, policy decisions. Thank you.
Thanks, Sandeep. And the question is taking these interventions to scale, and a country the size of India has probably shown the way with some of these technologies. Before I go on to the last question, which I would request Juliet to address, I wanted to mention that the Secretariat will share with you the various links that Juliet has provided in terms of best practices from her work at Resilience Shift. So they will make sure that these links are available to all participants. And now to the question to you, Juliet. Since you talked about behavioral change, the question is, how can we take into account culture when promoting behavioral change in relation to resilient infrastructure? A tough one, but I'm sure you all.
I know. Yeah, in the 1 minute, that we have left, Preety. I guess a simple answer would be, well, it's essential that we do take into account culture, and you can't push behavioral change. And I'm very, interested in the science of the sort of nudge behavior. What can you do to create that change? And again, I think COVID has created a lot of behavioral changes. So we have learned from that it can happen, but probably the one answer is I've given at least three, sorry. Communication and engagement. So I talked to, if part of how we enhance resilience is the behavior of those who are using our infrastructure, then to engage with them at the beginning in the decision so that they understand that, so that their expectations are managed, they see where and when they might need to adapt their behavior, and not to just sort of mandate that at the end. I think that's where it becomes difficult. So to engage with those and understand their own sort of cultural requirements from much earlier on in the decision-making process.
Thank you. Thank you, and let me thank all the panelists for their engagement and their time for this session, and also the panelists, also the participants for actively engaging and raising some very, very good questions on what could be done in these uncertain times. I think we are ending on an upbeat note over here, despite the challenges that we are facing currently, with all the examples that have been shared, very practical examples from Tonga, from PRC, from Myanmar, and also, the partnerships that are being forged to take this discourse forward. And with that, I would like to thank everybody, and especially the Secretariat of the Transport Forum, which has helped put together this session. And if I could mention Pam, Belinda, Michelle, Francesco, Orgo, and Sugar, who've put in quite a bit of time in designing the session and contacting the right speakers so that you had a fruitful 100 minutes or so of discussion in this session. So thanks to everybody. And on this note, let me close the session and wish you all the very best. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.